So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Day to Day around the house. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why you have two drains for your evaporative unit that's up on your AC unit in your attic, and why you should never have water coming out of the second drain, and how to fix that problem and what can happen if you don't. So even if your unit looks a little different than this one, these general concepts should apply to almost any evaporative unit. So this video has quite a bit of information in it, and if you don't want to listen to the whole thing, here is a chapter index of what I talk about and what times they take place. So if you end up enjoying this video and it gives you some good information, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible, so I don't waste your time. So let's get to it. So somewhere in your house or garage, you're going to have access to your attic. I actually have both, and that is because I have spray foam insulation, and there is a spray foam wall between the garage and the house. So my access to the evaporative unit is actually the one that is in my laundry room. So once you get up there, you should have a light switch to give you some light up there. I turn that on, and this is your evaporative unit. Now you'll notice you'll have two PVC drain lines here, one coming out of the actual unit itself and one coming out of the drain pan underneath it. So the drain line coming out of the evaporative unit should be your lower drain on the side of the house, and the one coming out of the drain pan should be the upper drain on the side of the house. In a perfect world, you should never actually get water in this drain pan because it should always drain out of the evaporative unit. However, if this line gets clogged, then obviously it's going to overfill, start putting water into the drain pan, and go out that secondary drain. Now, if you keep neglecting the fact that your pipes are getting clogged and you let it drain through the secondary, eventually that's probably going to get filled with algae and it could possibly clog. And then what can happen is it will overflow your drain pan and start spilling onto your ceiling. So I had something very similar to this happen to me about 1.5 years after moving into this brand new house 10 years ago. But in my case, what had happened is the evaporative drain did clog. So it started filling up the drain pan underneath the evaporative unit. However, the builders had left some material that was clogging the secondary drain, and therefore it overfilled my drain pan and buckled it. This is the repair they ended up doing. You can see that they ran an extra strap in the center of the drain pan to help support it after it buckled. After the repair, they ended up having to come out and put 2 new pieces of drywall, retape, and retexturing my ceiling. So now I'm going to go over why these lines get clogged and what you can do to make it easier to fix in the future. So back when that pan buckled on me and made a big mess, these drain lines were all hard plumbed in and I had no way to get in there and clean them. So what I ended up doing is cutting the PVC and adding 2 union fittings so I could take this section of the drain apart where the P-trap is and clean it out in the sink. If you don't like the idea of this modification that I'm making to make it easier to clean it out, I am going to show you a different way to do it as well closer to the end of this video. So you'll see right here that I'm trying to put water in that one side and there's nothing coming out of the breather or the other side of the P-trap. We used a sink clog removal tool to push through that P-trap, like one of these that's on Amazon, to remove that clog in that P-trap. Then I glued my PVC unions on that pipe and put it back into place on the drain off of the evaporative unit. So normally I just use the regular PVC primer and cement. However, because this was going to be up in my attic and I did not want any issues, I did end up buying the Christie's Red Hot Blue Glue with the primer. So with PVC, in case you haven't done it before, you want to do primer on both sides of your fittings, then spread the glue on both sides of the fittings as well, and then just press them together. You want to hold those together for probably 10 to 15 seconds. Because if you don't, the fitting might start pushing off of the actual PVC tube. Once I got all the unions glued on, then I just assembled it. They just twist together. There is an O-ring seal in there. Make sure that's in there before tightening it down. And then I usually go a little bit beyond hand tight just to make sure I've got no leaks. So I've used these unions in my saltwater aquarium hobby for years and years without any leaks or problems. but just because it was up in my attic and I didn't want any possibility of something dripping onto my ceiling, I did end up putting a plastic bin underneath it to catch any possibility of a leak just in case. So it's been about a year since I put those unions on, and the evaporative line is clogged again. So I'm just going to show you how quick and easy it is now that I've got these unions on here to take this apart, clean it out, and put it back together. So I'm using a pair of channel locks and an oil filter wrench to loosen these unions up. That oil filter wrench actually works really well for these, and about the last thing I've used that wrench on is an oil filter, but it comes in handy for all kinds of other things. So most likely if these lines get clogged, it's going to be algae that caused the clog, because it's a perfect environment and breeding ground for algae in these condensation lines. The reason for that is hot air is blowing across a cold evaporator coil and creates a very humid environment, which just so happens is the perfect environment for algae to thrive. So I've come to the realization that this needs to be done annually, and I usually do it before it gets hot, before summer, because that's obviously when the most condensation is going to be coming off that thing and the most likely time it's going to start to clog. This year I decided to try something different to maybe make it last a little longer. I plugged the one end of the pipe, and then I poured distilled vinegar in there and let it sit for about a half an hour, and then cleaned it out one more time. My thought is try and get a little bit more algae out of there, or completely out of there, so that it's not there to start growing immediately once I put it back together. Something else I also did differently this time is I got an air pump for blowing up like air mattresses, and I plugged it in. If you have a light up in your attic, you should have a power outlet as well. And I went ahead and blew through the lines going down to the outside of the house, just to make sure there was no other material or anything in those lines. And then I had my wife down at the other end to make sure she felt good pressure coming out of the house, to make sure there was no restriction. I used that drain clog tool to try and pull some of the algae out of the actual evaporative unit. But what I ended up deciding to do is go ahead and put my P-trap assembly back on, but angle it up so I could pour vinegar down in the evaporative unit to hopefully kill off a lot of the algae buildup that's in the pan of the unit itself. Once again, to maybe make it last a little longer before it will get clogged again. I did end up pouring quite a bit of vinegar in there until I saw a drip come out of the evaporative unit, just as if the line was clogged and it was going to that secondary pan. I let it sit in there for about a half an hour before draining it into the plastic bin that I keep up in the attic. I went ahead and dumped my plastic bin into the drip pan for the evaporative unit, because I figured that vinegar that was in that water would help flush out anything that might be stuck in that secondary drain. During the process of editing this video to put on YouTube, I realized that this secondary drain is where that water is supposed to come out of. It should not be coming out of the tape around the edge of the evaporator. So I ended up pulling both of these fittings off. Using a shop vac, I put a vacuum to those holes, got some of that out. Then I ended up making an extension out of a long piece of plastic hose and sticking that down in the evaporative unit so I could get as much of that dried up algae as I could out of it, because the less there is in the unit, the longer it's going to take to clog that P-trap. And since I had the shop vac up there, I decided to go ahead and vacuum up all the residual water and any other chunks that had fallen into the drain pan as well. I applied some plumber's tape to both of the fittings and then reassembled the P-trap and the drain back on the evaporative unit. The overflow for the evaporative unit was pointing straight up. I ended up pointing it more towards the side, still above the level of the primary drain, because obviously with it pointing straight up, it was too high and forcing it to come out of somewhere where it shouldn't have been. Then I went ahead and reassembled my P-trap. I tightened the unions down by hand, and then once again using the channel locks and my oil filter wrench, I gave them a little bit extra. So if for whatever reason you don't like the idea of putting those unions in there, either because of the possibility of a leak or whatever, there is another way you can make it easier to clean this P-trap out. You could remove the 90 going into the evaporative unit and replace that with a T. Then put a little piece of PVC above that with a PVC cap. And therefore you can untwist that cap using that drain clog tool, or a really long zip tie works. Dislodge all that algae and crap that is in the P-trap. Then, using quite a bit of distilled vinegar and a funnel, dump the vinegar down that same piece of PVC, flushing all that crap out through the drain line on the side of the house. While doing this, I would recommend putting somebody to watch the drain on the side of the house to make sure whatever was clogging that P-trap did come out, so you don't end up pushing it just deeper down in the PVC tubing somewhere and possibly create a clog there. And then just twist the plastic PVC cap back on by hand when you're done. I would make that piece of PVC coming up out of the T about 3 inches, just to make sure that your PVC cap is above the level of the evaporative unit if it overflows, because you will not be gluing that PVC cap so you can remove it easily. So after cleaning out those drains, you can see that my top drain is nice and dry, and I do already have some drips coming out of the bottom drain, which is where it's supposed to be. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. Once again, if so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.